I'm from Vancouver monthly meeting of Canadian yearly meeting, and I'm also a member of Vancouver Independent Jewish Voices, which is a bit like Jewish Voice for Peace, perhaps a little bit to the left, partly because we're smaller and we can get decisions made a little quicker. My book, as you can see, is called Refusing to be Enemies, Palestinian and Israeli Nonviolent Resistance to the Israeli Occupation. The book has a long title for a reason. Refusing to be enemies because so many people still assume that there are two opposing sides, Israeli and Palestinian, who are enemies. Whereas in fact, there are many from both communities who work side by side resisting the occupation. And the subtitle, because so many think of resistance as something employed by bomb-throwing extremists and are unaware that the overwhelming majority of acts of resistance to the systemic violence of the occupation are actually nonviolent acts by ordinary people. So, as you know, my name is Maxine Kaufman-Lacusta with a hyphen, and my name isn't the only thing about me that's hyphenated. I'm also a Quaker Jew and a Canadian-Israeli, or Israeli-Canadian, a dual citizen of both countries. And once upon a time, I was an American Zionist. In fact, in 1959 and 60, I was an idealistic teenager participating in a Zionist youth workshop on an Israeli agricultural collective, or kibbutz. My personal goal at the time was to live on a kibbutz, though not for nationalistic or Zionist reasons, so much as because I was attracted to the idea of a community where children didn't live with their parents. I spent about 16 months checking that out, 10 on the Labor Zionist Youth Program that I mentioned, and another 6 on a different kibbutz with a group of Israeli kids headed for the branch of the Israeli army that formed nuclei for new kibbutzim and reinforcing groups for existing ones, Nahal, or Fighting Pioneer Youth. After that 6 months, however, I no longer had any illusions that the kibbutz was still a pioneering venture, and a year of university pretty well rid me of any lingering enthusiasm for nationalism, including Zionism. But although I had been long sympathetic to the Palestinians displaced by the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, to me they had remained simply refugees, unfortunate victims of war for whom the neighboring countries should find a humane solution. The big change for me came in 1979 when I attended a 3-week Quaker-sponsored program in Ramallah in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. And there I had the opportunity to meet Palestinians on their own turf for the first time. And I began to develop an understanding for Palestinians' attachment to this land that I knew my people, the Jewish people, had been long attached to. And to realize that one way or another, we, Jews and Palestinians, would have to work out a way to live together in this land that we both love and both consider our homeland. I made a couple of further visits to the region in the mid-'80s, and from December of 1988 through mid-October 95, I lived and worked in Jerusalem. For much of that time as a Hebrew to English translator at the Jerusalem office of the Alternative Information Center, or AIC. This is a joint Israeli-Palestinian venture whose website you will find on your sheets on alternativenews.org. And at the same time, I was participating in a variety of solidarity and joint activism, including a small nonviolence training collective. I've been back 11 times since I returned to Canada in the fall of '95, mostly in connection with this book project, or to refresh my sense of the place and of the nonviolent activism there, so as to better keep my presentations up to date, most recently in September of 2014. As I mentioned, I returned to Canada in late '95. So when the Al-Aqsa Intifada broke out in October of 2000, I'd been back in Canada for 5 years. I began thinking, what could I do in the new situation? I was feeling that I was maybe getting a bit old to try to stand in front of bulldozers and the like. So I made a trip in December of 2000 to just get a feel for where I could fit in. I made a brief visit, and what I found were that both Israelis and Palestinians were not only still engaged in nonviolent activism as they had been during the Intifada, but were actually beginning to call it by that name, which they hadn't before, and to reach out to the worldwide nonviolent movement. So I decided the time had come for a book of interviews describing both Palestinian and Israeli nonviolent activism in a single volume. And since I'm a Jewish citizen of Israel, I didn't want to embark on this project until I had a Palestinian partner. Hassan Andoni, who was then the director of the Palestinian Center for Rapprochement in Beit Zahur near Jerusalem, and later a co-founder of International Solidarity Movement, or ISM, agreed to work with me. He's the one without the beard. I made my first trip in connection with the book in the fall of 2003. I began my 6-week stay by meeting with many of the Palestinians that Hassan and his colleagues at the PCR had introduced me to. I figured that if I ran afoul of the Israeli authorities and got banned from the West Bank, I would at least already have some Palestinian interviews under my belt, and I could continue in Israel at my leisure. Jeff Halper, the one with the beard, of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, joined the project about a week into that trip, and Hassan and Jeff have both provided invaluable editorial input and guidance throughout, in addition to their interview and written contributions to the work. So today I'll introduce the book and a few of the many interviewees and organizations that made it possible, as well as some of the nonviolent strategies that have been effective. We'll also take a look at where nonviolent activism in Palestine and Israel is at more recently, and what roles we as internationals, folks living outside the area, can play in supporting these important efforts, whether on the ground in Palestine or here at home. So probably most of you have seen these 4 maps. The first version I saw only had the 3 to the right. I think the addition of the 1946 map is extremely important because you can see the green being Palestinian-held land, the white being Zionist or later Israeli-held land. You can see the shift. And when people sometimes naively ask, well, in 1947, when the UN made their partition plan, they gave approximately half the land to each of the 2 groups. Isn't that fair? Well, if you look, it's really more like somebody came into the Palestinians' backyard and then said, well, we'll let you have half of it back. You know, would you be happy if someone did that to you? Of course not. Looking at the final map here, you can see what's happening to hopes of a 2-state solution. It's becoming less and less achievable. The white there on the West Bank part of that 2010 map, and even more so today, is Israeli settlement blocks, the so-called bypass roads connecting settlements with cities inside Israel, blurring the line between the 2, and now also the wall, or the separation barrier as it's euphemistically called. This picture here gives you some idea of the prevalence of Israeli Jewish-only settlements in the West Bank. And this is from 2002. If you want to get really depressed, you can look at one of the websites on the list. The American Friends of Peace Now have a link to the Peace Now or Shalom Achshav project of following all of the settlement development and water use and so on. And you can click on each settlement and find out its date of founding, how big it is, and so on and so forth. And there'll be even more dots on the map, of course. And the root of the barrier that is referred to officially as the security barrier, but also commonly the separation wall, or to borrow from the Afrikaans word for separation, the apartheid wall. Anybody recognize what's written on it? No Bible scholars. You can see it's in the middle section.
The handwriting on the wall.
Exactly. The handwriting on the wall. This is near Bethlehem. I thought that was a really clever thing to put on there. And the degree to which this barrier deviates from the armistice line of 1949, so-called Green Line, and cuts into Palestinian territory, effectively cutting farmers off from their fields, putting the blue bits there. It's not bodies of water, unfortunately. It's areas where Palestinian land has been put on the Israeli side of the fence or the wall, meaning that if you're a farmer on this side and you need to get there to do your work, you have to get a hard-to-get permit, and then there's no guarantees that the gates in the wall will be open when they're supposed to be. It's very arbitrary. So it's basically a land grab. Somebody was saying it's also a water grab. There's a map somewhere of where the water resources are located. Apparently those are areas under the ground where there's a lot of water. But I know also that in general, the water under the West Bank, 80% of it goes into Israel for irrigation. Now, I also want to make it clear that nothing that I say today and nothing I've written in the book is meant to imply that nonviolence is new to Palestinians or that it was somehow brought to them by Israelis or internationals. They've been doing it for a really long time. In fact, Palestinian nonviolent resistance to colonization goes back over 100 years, at least as far as 1902, and includes a 6-month general strike in the 30s and a multitude of nonviolent actions since 1967, at the beginning of the occupation, most notably during the first Intifada of 1987 through 93, when it had estimated 80 to 95% of the actions called for by the leaflets handed out by the unified leadership of the Intifada were for nonviolent actions, and included various forms of demonstrations and strikes, including repeated hunger strikes by Palestinians held often without charge in Israeli prisons. And these go on today. You can see a relatively recent date on there. Flying the Palestinian flag, wearing the colors of the Palestinian flag, hanging your clothes in the colors of the Palestinian flag in the days when it was forbidden by the Israeli administration for these colors to be shown together. I once saw a little boy who had 2 of the colors on his clothing and his bike was the other 2 colors. So I guess he could separate himself from that if he encountered a soldier or a policeman. Refusing to pay Israeli taxes, refusing to collect Israeli taxes. One man in Beit Zahor commented, "Why should we pay taxes to pay for the bullets to kill our children?" Alternative school classes, alternative university classes, when schools and universities were closed for months at a time. Victory gardens and other initiatives aimed at increasing economic self-sufficiency. I understand that one of your members has a copy of the wonderful film, The Wanted 18, which is about an effort at self-sufficiency by buying cows to produce their own milk. And it's not only instructive, it's very funny. It's a well-done film, and ask Alex about it later if you don't know about it. And a plethora of alternative institutions, some going back to the 60s and 70s, and of course, Sumud, or steadfastly remaining in the country, trying to lead a dignified life despite the oppressive policies of the occupation. Many of these are described in 2 excellent American Friends Service Committee monographs, and you can find the links for those on your sheets. So I won't go into that now, except to say that there's a timeline going back to 1902 on one of them. The other one brings things more up to date, up to, I believe, about 2013. And they have links also to other images and things that are going on in that area. So American Friends Service Committee website is a really good place to look. And for those wanting to see all this in a historical context, a dimension that's largely missing from my book, I recommend Popular Struggle in Palestine, A History of Hope and Empowerment by Mazen Qamsiyeh, who's a professor and nonviolent activist living in Bethlehem. In it, he cites and contextualizes numerous additional examples going back to the late 19th and early 20th century. So I'm going to take a drink of water. Oops. So back to refusing to be enemies. I put the book together based mainly on over 100 interviews that I did between 2003 and 2010 with Palestinian and Israeli activists in roughly equal numbers. But I should add that very early on in my interviews, it became clear to me that despite the seeming balance of the numbers, this book should not be simply a description of nonviolent activism by Israeli groups on the one side, by Palestinian groups on the other. Its primary focus must be on the vast scope and variety of Palestinian nonviolent activism in which Israelis and sometimes internationals play an important but supporting role. Now, I'm not going to review the contents of the book. You're welcome to have a browse over there later. But I would like to introduce you to a small sample of the folks that I interviewed to give you some idea of the human aspect of this occupation. Now, a number of those I interviewed for the book, Israeli, Palestinian, religious, or secular, were lifelong proponents of nonviolence, and most of the rest were at least strongly averse to using violence, despite the fact that international law allows subject peoples to resist by any means at their disposal. For instance, Veronica Cohen is a modern Orthodox Jewish woman, which means she's from the segment of the Israeli population most often associated with religious, ideologically motivated, often militant settlers in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. Yet, Veronica is anything but that. In fact, she was being active on behalf of Palestinian rights as far back as the mid-'80s, even before the beginning of the First Intifada. And I most recently saw her and her husband at a demonstration in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem in 2010 or 12. I can't remember which now. But these folks keep on and keep on. And I noticed when I interviewed her in 2006, she was no longer wearing the snood, or what I refer to as Jewish hijab, that she used to wear covering her hair as a religious woman. I said, have you become less religious? She said, no, but I don't want to be confused with settler women. Nouri El-Olbi is a Bedouin and a Palestinian citizen of Israel. And although my book doesn't talk a whole lot about what's going on inside the borders of Israel, I think it's really important to understand that many of the Palestinians there are in very similar situation to those in the West Bank. In some cases, some folks say even worse. Nouri's tribe was expelled from land on the edge of the Negev desert village of El-Alaqib in 1951, and they were told, this is going to be 6 months that the army needs your land, then you can come back. Well, in 2006, when these 6 months had stretched to nearly 60 years, Nouri decided to bear nonviolent witness by moving back to his family's land. He took his camper van, he pitched a makeshift tent, and he remained there, beside the tree he'd been born under, according to his brother, for 4 years. And despite frequent arrests, he kept returning and repitching his tent. And after a trial that ran several months, he was barred from his land by court order. But he still maintains that every drop that's spilled is a sad waste, and that human beings are forbidden to use violence. El-Alaqib itself has been demolished repeatedly over the past several years, 97 times as of April 21st, possibly more since then, I don't know. And the Jewish National Fund, or JNF, plants trees on the rubble. This is an organization that has tax-deductible charitable status in both the US and Canada. I don't know about here, but in Canada there is a campaign to try to get it to lose that status. Why should people get tax relief for displacing people? The JNF maintains that they want to make a nice green place for the Bedouins to have picnics, but what they need is a place where they can live. They're now being sued by the Israeli government to pay for the demolitions. It's kind of adding insult to injury, I would say. Following the 90th demolition of El-Alaqib last October, one of the local activists defiantly declared, "They will not break us, we don't have anywhere to go, and we have nothing left to lose. We won't let them banish us from our land." To any of you who've been in the West Bank, those words will probably sound very familiar. This is coming from citizens of Israel, many of whom served in the Israeli army, and yet they're being treated like a subject people. I won't say more about that. El-Alaqib is an extreme case, but it is one of dozens of unrecognized Palestinian villages inside Israel, facing constant threat of arbitrary demolition and are being denied even the minimal amenities in the way of schools, electricity, and water provided for other Palestinian Israeli communities at a level much below that of the Jewish Israeli communities. Back to the West Bank. May, is that a familiar face?
Yes, Jean.
That's Jean. Jean Zaru is a Palestinian Quaker, the author of Occupied with Nonviolence. There's a copy back there that you can browse. I love the pun. It's an account of what it's like to be a Palestinian under occupation, a woman in a male-dominated society, a Quaker and a Christian. In her case, not all Quakers are Jews, as you know. The influence of her faith on her rejection of violence and support for resistance. Amos Wirtz is a rarity. He's a pacifist kibbutznik. This means that he was raised with the most thoroughgoing Zionist education a kid could get. Yet by the time he reached army age, he determined he was not going to serve in the territories. He was also not going to do any combat duty. And although there is no conscientious objector status or alternative service officially provided for males in Israel, he managed to carve out a space for himself to do an alternative service, non-military, but inside the army. And he worked with people with learning disabilities and continues to think and write and be an activist on behalf of Palestinians and on behalf of nonviolence more generally. He has a piece called A Call for an Escalation of Nonviolence that you can find on the web page of the Palestine-Israel Journal, for instance. Another water break, sorry. And some of my interviewees were actually former supporters or even practitioners of armed struggle. For instance, Adi Jeddah was a high school student when the Israeli occupation began in 1967. He was planning to become a lawyer. He was attending a prestigious school in East Jerusalem, Collège de Frères, but he had to drop out to help support his family. He became swept up in what he describes as a circle of violence at the time. He got involved in militant politics, put a bomb in Jaffa Road where it injured 9 Israelis. And he spent the next 13 years in prison. And during that time, he had a change of heart, a kind of a conversion to nonviolence. While he was in prison, Adi told me, he'd come to the conclusion that his main allies in his, quote, struggle against the occupation should be the Israelis themselves, that sector of Israeli society who are totally against the occupation and who are looking forward for a secular democratic state in which both of us could live together in real peace and equality, unquote. And after he was released, he went to work at the jointly run Alternative Information Center, which is where I met him. He and his cousin Mahmoud, who are both former longtime prisoners, now give alternative or political tours of Jerusalem's old city. Yonatan Shapira is another former fighter. Find this. Oh, it's being used. He was the son of an officer in the Israeli Air Force, in which he too proudly served. He became disillusioned, especially in the wake of Israel's targeted killings of Hamas leaders in the Gaza Strip, often involving bombing of crowded civilian neighborhoods, with resultant large numbers of civilian deaths and woundings. Yonatan was at the core of a group of 27 Air Force officers, some of quite high rank, who signed the so-called pilot's letter to the Israeli Minister of Defense in September of 2003, in which they denounced these actions as war crimes. They were kicked out of the Air Force, and he and some other members of his group, along with like-minded Palestinian ex-fighters, together went on to found Combatants for Peace, one of the few fully joint organizations I've encountered, and we'll see more about that later. Now you have to pretend I'm holding up a DVD because it's serving a very important function under the projector here. Yonatan continues working for, Yonatan Shapira is also one of 3 nonviolent activists, along with one Palestinian Muslim, Ahmed Al-Azeh, one Palestinian Christian, Sami Awad, who's a nephew of Mubarak Awad, and himself, profiled in the excellent film Little Town of Bethlehem. You're not going to forget where you can find out more about that. It's at the unforgettable website, littletownofbethlehem.org. Yonatan continues working for Palestinian human rights, including sailing on 2 or 3 of the boats for the Free Gaza movement, breaking the siege of Gaza. And I highly recommend watching a talk he gave last November in Vancouver, which is a link on your sheets, in which he movingly tells how he got involved and explains his support for BDS, or Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. Lastly, Netta Golan, the woman with glasses and long hair, and also shown at the side with her kids a few years ago. They're a lot bigger now. She's a co-founder of the International Solidarity Movement, which brings folks from abroad, or internationals as we're called, to support Palestinians in their nonviolent resistance to the occupation and to report on their experiences to folks back home. This brings voices, of people that you know, who've seen what they've seen, and they come back, and when they talk to people in their own communities, they are a lot more credible than anything you might read in the media. And so this is a really valuable function. Netta is a Jewish Israeli woman who got involved in nonviolent activism on behalf of Palestinians through family connections. When I visited her in late 2000, in the early days of the Al-Aqsa, or Second Intifada, she'd been living in Nablus with the family of her Palestinian fiancé, whom she'd met through dialogue activities. This is unusual, but this is what happened, and this got her involved because her future brother-in-law worked in a nearby village, and he kept coming back with stories about how the people in the village were being hounded by neighboring settlers. The farmers couldn't work in their fields and so on. The settlers and the military were just making life miserable for them. And so Netta told me that she felt that as an Israeli, she could effectively confront the settlers and soldiers. And even though she wasn't at the time an activist or trained in this kind of thing, she was a shiatsu therapist. But she just went down to the village. She found allies among the villagers, and she spent the next few months living with different families, couch surfing as we'd say now, while joining in locally organized nonviolent actions, such as removing roadblocks, replacing water lines that had been cut when army bulldozers came to knock down little olive trees that they said people were hiding behind so they could throw stones, and so on. And she would invite other Israelis to come and join them. But she told me how frustrated she was becoming. In the 2 months or so she'd been in the village, few Israelis had come, and then they had to go home again after the action. And this led the villagers to bear the brunt of any reprisals. What was needed, she felt, were people who could, like her, stay in the village as a protective presence. In fact, she told me that she and some other folks, including Palestinian activists and Luisa Morgantini of the European Parliament, were cooking up an idea for an international solidarity movement. Well, I thought it was a total pipe dream. I mean, people weren't coming from 3 hours away, but they come from halfway around the world. Well, fortunately, I kept my mouth shut, because as many of you know, within a few months, the ISM was up and running, and now tens of thousands of people from around the world have come to do exactly what Netta had hoped. And she's still active in this. Now, although most joint nonviolent activism in Palestine has taken place in the context of cooperation between uninational groups, either through formal coalitions or informal arrangements between Palestinian and Israeli organizations, there are some inspiring examples of fully joint ventures. Among those are my Jerusalem workplace, the AIC that I mentioned, Combatants for Peace, the Palestine-Israel Journal. Another was the Action Committee for the Jahalin Tribe, which are pictured on the cover of my book. And the picture on the cover of the book is a little bit wider than this one, and in it there are actually 2 members of the Israeli Knesset, or Parliament or Knesset, 2 rabbis, and you can also see here, wife of one of the rabbis, lawyer, etc. But you also may notice that we're not standing in some busy place where a lot of people could watch. We're standing in the middle of the desert because that's where these Bedouins live. But this was late 94 or early 95, and by that time, quite a few young Palestinians were working as stringers for various foreign news outlets. So they would come, they'd take their films, and then they'd run into town and put the tapes in the mail, and in a day or two we'd see it on television. So that was a useful way to get the word out, and attracted some very important people. We also provided a protective presence. We have people go at night, usually 2 by 2, with a cell phone. If you remember, this is in the mid-90s, the cell phone was at least this size. And the idea was that if that bulldozer got too close, or anybody else tried to bother the folks, we would call media and other activists and so on. And we bought them over 3 years. And when in February of 1997, they were actually forcibly removed. By that time, they had built good relationships with a variety of organizations, including Rabbis for Human Rights, who got them a really effective lawyer. And so they actually got a measure of security unusual for West Bank Palestinians, including building permits, access to electricity and water. However, some of the other members of the same tribe were not so lucky. If you live in the area, that blue area marked E1, and you're Palestinian, you are the target of Israeli expansion wanting to make that whole area basically Jewish-Israeli settlements. And this would mean, among other things, that the access between the north and the south of the West Bank would be totally cut off. It's bad enough as it is. And so anybody living in that area is likely to be under demolition orders and the rest of it. And there's a lovely short film at the website on your list, jahani.org, that explains the background and the situation, particularly for the encampment at Khan al-Ahmar. There's another film that was made by some of the people who are being supportive of the Jahalin. It's called High Hopes, and it's a documentary that's been shown at film festivals. And the hopes that they're talking about, of course, are the hopes that many people, not just the Bedouins, had at the time of the signing of the Oslo Accords in September of 1993. And unfortunately, theirs were not the only high hopes that were dashed in the ensuing 7 years. In those years between the signing of the Accords and the outbreak of the Second or Al-Aqsa Intifada, and the period of the so-called peace process, which was purportedly to lead to an independent state for Palestinians, it was actually a time of increasing oppression. With continued spread of Israeli settlements, acceleration in the demolition of Palestinian homes, construction of the so-called bypass roads that I mentioned, which only began in 1995, and the introduction of increasingly stringent limitations on the movement of Palestinians by means of hundreds of checkpoints, not only between the shrinking Palestinian-held territories and Israel proper, but mainly within the West Bank, making travel from one village or town to the next, not to mention between different areas of the West Bank or to and from Gaza, increasingly difficult and often virtually impossible. And all of this was in stark contrast to what was being reported outside. And as well, unfortunately, not all joint activism of Palestinians and Israelis following the signing of the Oslo Accords were as constructive as the ones I've mentioned. And most dialogue did not lead to dedicated anti-occupation activism like that I described at Meta Golan. Often dialogue and other people-to-people initiatives, not to mention the negotiations of the peace process itself, were conducted in a sort of vacuum, as if the oppression of the occupation was not ongoing. This is a phenomenon referred to as normalization. So, after 7 years of increasing oppression during the post-Oslo peace process, the Palestinian non-governmental organization umbrella body called upon all Palestinian non-NGOs to stop joint programs and activities with Israeli organizations, especially those conducted in the framework of the people-to-people program. They weren't going anywhere, as well as any other project aiming at normalization with Israel. Now, it's important to note that this prohibition was never applied to cooperation with solidarity projects of Israeli human rights organizations or with institutions that support Palestinian national rights. But one thing was very clear. After 2000, when Palestinian frustrations erupted in the Second or Al-Aqsa Intifada, if Israelis were to continue to join Palestinians, it could no longer be just for a cup of tea and some dialogue. As Hoida Araf stated, the issue has got to be the occupation. Or as Yonatan Shapira made clear at a forum on BDS in Vancouver, BC last November, co-resistance must come before coexistence. So what happened subsequently is that some forms of joint activity, notably many of the dialogue and people-to-people activities that had not progressed beyond the talk and tea stage, decreased in number. But joint activism continued, and new forms evolved, always with the condition that focus beyond ending the occupation, and that Palestinians must be the ones to decide whether Israeli groups would be invited. And these principles are still strictly followed by all of the Israeli and international organizations that continue to work side by side with Palestinians. That's a picture from a march to a demonstration in the village of Delin on the route of the wall, where they have been holding nonviolent demonstrations against the wall and encroachment of settlements since early 2005, every week. And they've also had a number of annual international conferences on nonviolent resistance. Oops. Okay, so what are some of the newer 21st century forms of support by Israelis for an end to the occupation and for Palestinian rights? And how effective are these strategies? A lot has to do with simply being there, when invited, either as active participants or as witnesses, or both. It's been observed that the presence of Israelis and/or internationals can both diminish violence against Palestinian activists and diminish feelings of isolation of Palestinians in general. It can humanize Israelis and internationals for Palestinians, and vice versa. And of course, such witness participants can be extremely effective in combating misconceptions and sharing a more accurate picture of the situation in Palestine based on their own experiences and personal observations when they returned home, as I mentioned. This supportive presence can even sometimes facilitate some semblance of normal life for Palestinians, for instance, enabling farmers to harvest crops unmolested. As we post in Nanoon, a village that was basically emptied because they had been attacked and then threatened that they'd all be killed by the neighboring settlers. And only when they had the assurance of ongoing protection by groups, both international and Israeli groups, did some of them return. And this is a group, this picture was taken during olive picking help by 3 busloads of Israelis that went down there. This was in 2003. These pictures were taken in 2012. Some of the villages were still there, and groups like the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program, the Israeli group Daesh, and ISM volunteers were still being a protective presence. Actually, on this particular occasion, I was with some folks from the ISM in Nablus, and we were called to do some accompanying shepherds so they could go closer to the parts of their fields that were close to the settlement. Fortunately, the most exciting thing that happened on that trip was that one of the goats decided to give birth. Also, Israeli women's organizations have employed a number of innovative strategies over the years. I know some of you are familiar with Women in Black. Do you know who these ladies are up in the corner there? Not their names, but what organization?
It's several different organizations.
Up in the corner. Anybody recognize? Did you say Raging Grannies?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. The lady with the red hat, Aliastos, is a member of Women's International International League for Peace and Freedom. She was at a WILP conference in the States a few years back. She heard the grannies and she said, we can do that. And she went home, got about a half a dozen of her friends together. And they do here. You know, they put satirical political lyrics to popular songs. Most of those are in Hebrew, of course, but one I heard them sing in Berlin in 2006 was in English. I think I need more water for this minute. There is no wall in Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. There is no wall in Jericho. And then they would pause and list all the towns and villages impacted by the wall. And then they end, there is no wall in Jericho. Not yet. Another of the women's groups that have been very effective is Mahzon Watch or Checkpoint Watch. Checkpoint, you can see here, is between the village of Huara and the city of Nablus, where the hospital and all sorts of other central services are located. And at the time this was taken, in 2006, maybe you can't see, but this long thing looks a bit like a catalog. It's full of people waiting, and they were being processed one at a time. And this is not, it's not there anymore. There's a little kiosk, and maybe the soldier will look at you. So I'm not sure how much influence the presence of the Checkpoint Watch women had on the reduction of the severity of that particular checkpoint and a few others, but you know, maybe they did. But besides that, it's a group of mainly middle-aged and older Jewish Israeli women who can use to good advantage that fact of being both female and Israeli, but also the fact that they look a lot like the soldiers' mothers and grandmothers. They use that in confronting and attempting to ameliorate human rights violations at the checkpoints inside the West Bank, as well as those dividing the West Bank from Israel. And they report on these, they document and publicize these violations to Israeli legislators and to the media at large. And they now also give tours in both English and Hebrew, so if you're in the area, look them up, literally. Military refusal is an important form of nonviolent non-cooperation in Israel. The first organized refusal goes back to the days of Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon. And the oldest refusnik organization is called Yesh Gvul, which means both there's a border and there's a limit. Its members refused to serve across the border in Lebanon in the 80s, and now they refuse to serve across the Green Line in the occupied territories. And the late Peretz Kidron, who was one of the founders of Yesh Gvul, described refusal as, quote, the most effective way of campaigning against the occupation, since there's no occupation without an army of occupation, and there's no army of occupation without soldiers. He defined Yesh Gvul members' selective refusal, that is, they're not pacifists, but they're saying we won't do this, we will not serve there. He defined this as a form of civil disobedience, and he likened it to Gandhi's Salt March, not violent, but deliberately flouting the law and inviting prosecution. And I think a very particularly courageous form of military refusal is that of the so-called Shministim. These are high school seniors who each year, going back at least as far as 1980, perhaps earlier, have written letters to the Israeli Minister of Defense stating they would not serve in the military at all as long as the occupation continued. And being new recruits, they could serve a year or more in prison, not just a month here and there. Matan Kamener, shown over here, when I interviewed him, had been spending close to a year in what they called open detention. They let him out to cross the street and speak to me. You may notice he's not wearing a uniform. And he said this really got people talking. You know, the other recruits were all in army uniforms. In fact, he felt that this made them, you know, maybe think about what was going on in the occupation and so on. And when he and the others in his group were tried and sentenced to an additional year, in addition to what they'd served while waiting trial, they were made to serve in civilian facilities because it was felt they were a bad influence on the other recruits. So. Elik El-Hanan and Wa'ad Salman are members of Combatants for Peace. They're both ex-fighters. And in El-Hanan's words, they're bringing, in quotes, war criminals, Israelis, terrorists, Palestinians, to speak to high school and college students and ordinary people in both communities. And they tell them, we made the change from violence to nonviolence. If we could do it, anyone can. He says that that's a really effective approach. He said, nobody would listen to nice guys for peace. So when it comes to withholding cooperation with the occupation regime, military refusal is currently the major way that Israelis who support Palestinian rights do this. But it's not the only way. There are also hundreds of Israeli activists that commit civil disobedience by traveling to the other side of the separation wall to join in Palestinian-led protests or to provide accompaniment and protection from settler and military harassment from Palestinian farmers and shepherds. This kind of action, as I said, involves hundreds of Israeli activists, and it's also a way that internationalists can contribute. And a kind of novel thing is a quieter form of Israeli non-cooperation with the occupation. Disobedient women. This involves Israeli women who smuggle Palestinian women and their small children into Israel for a picnic or a day at the beach without applying for entry permits. So they're violating Israeli law. And for years, this kind of thing went on the quiet, on a small scale. People didn't talk about it, they certainly didn't write about it and sign their names because they could be subject to a couple of years in prison. Finally, the long-term activist, Ilana Hammerman, decided she was going to take the chance. And in 2010, she did that. She wrote an article in Haaretz newspaper. And she was questioned, but she wasn't arrested. 2 months later, another almost dozen Jewish Israeli women did the same. And by August of that year, they'd started in May. By August of that year, 600 disobedient Israelis had signed a petition vowing civil disobedience to attempt to overturn this immoral law. Others had vowed that they would support them if they were prosecuted. And Ilana stated at a conference at the Palestinian village of Beit Omar, which is one of the places that it is civil disobedience for an Israeli to enter. She said, the law regulating entry into Israel is illegal and should not be obeyed. And they vowed to continue to work to destabilize the system of military decrees and regulations that made the lives of their Palestinian friends and families and their families unbearable. So just kind of winding down here, on my last visit in 2014, I decided that I wanted to accompany some groups that I hadn't been with before, and I actually met a couple that I hadn't known about before. Navi Saleh is one of the villages which, like Be'in, is along the wall and has weekly demonstrations. The interesting thing about this particular demonstration, the white, by the way, is tear gas. The interesting thing here is that these teenage girls seem to be in charge. They were leading the singing, leading the chanting, leading the marching. That was kind of refreshing. I went with Ayush, which is a joint Palestinian and Jewish Israeli group to the South Hebron Hills. And there they do accompaniment and they try to intervene when there's abuse by the military or by settlers. They've also helped local people dig out wells that have been filled and so on. And of course, they report back what they see. It's kind of activist-oriented, whereas the Villages group is more social work-oriented. They support women's empowerment, people trying to finish their education, accessibility for handicapped people and the like. And they also get the word out. So just a few weeks ago, one of the villages that I visited with them, they had posted, this is what happened in the wake of a demolition. And in fact, just a few weeks after we visited together, there had been also demolitions in that area. Sorry. Don't do that. They also introduced me to Comet ME. Now, I read recently what The acronym COMET stands for, I don't remember what it is. Anybody here? No? Anyway, the point is that this is, again, a joint effort by Israelis and Palestinians putting together solar collector technology with wind generators and providing a kind of portable and affordable source of electricity. So you can sit in a bedroom tent and they have the freezer running and they might be watching television and, you know, relatively modern amenities. They also bring clean water to these 16 or 18 relatively isolated villages that are under constant threat of being displaced by surrounding settlements. And the Army's been bothering them also, at least back in the 80s. Sindiana of the Galilee is a group of women in northern Israel, both Israeli Jewish and Israeli Palestinian, who market olive products, honey, za'atar, and other things of that sort from northern Israel and from the northern West Bank. And there's some that feel that this is normalization because it's running a business together, it's not trying to end the occupation. But when I spoke to one of the Palestinian engineers at Comet ME about this, asking his opinion, he answered me kind of indirectly. He said his father was always strongly opposed to normalization, to acting as if it's business as usual, you know, ignoring the imbalance of power between Palestinians and Israelis. But he said when he explained that their work, like this work, is helping people stay on the land, he said his father became supportive. Daramesh is a town in central Israel, okay? And not even a village, it's a proper town with buildings and so on, that is under, and has been for the last 10 years or so, under threat of getting homes demolished because they can't get building permits, because the neighboring Jewish town doesn't want to extend their limits to them, and for whatever reason they can't get a charter on their own. And so this is stuff that's going on inside and outside. It's been said that joint nonviolent activity by Palestinians and Israelis against the occupation is presently conceived as the most intimidating threat to the Israeli regime. They want to keep us apart. So where do we internationals from outside come in? As I mentioned, they can do the same kinds of things that Israelis do. You can participate in marches, you can go and do what we call accompaniment and that kind of thing. And there's a lot of links on those sheets I gave you for getting involved at various levels. You can also go to places like Tent of Nations. I know there was a speaker, Dawood Nasser, from there just recently in Austin. I don't know, did he get to Houston, or if any of you met him? This is basically a family trying to stay on their family farm. The grandfather bought land outside of Bethlehem. He registered it, and he registered originally with the Turks, and then with the English, and then with the Jordanians, and then with the Israelis. So it's all, you know, clear who owns the land. Yet they're still having problems staying. They're surrounded by settlements. The government will come in and say, well, you may own some of the land, but you don't own this land, and they'll take down a bunch of trees. They took 1,500 trees down last spring, and so on. They're getting a lot of support from people, particularly church people around the world, who come and send young volunteers and so on. These volunteers were working on helping refurbish habitable caves on the property, because when the grandfather moved out there, he decided to be different than the other farmers in Bethlehem. He wasn't going to live in town and go out and work. He was going to live with his family on the land, and they lived in those caves. 2 generations were raised in the caves. I'm told they're very comfortable, warm in the winter, cool in the summer. And now they're having to refurbish them because all of the buildings above ground are under demolition orders. They have a website that you can find there. Another thing that can be done by internationals is to participate in some Palestinian initiatives where Israelis might not be welcome. And there have been a few of those in recent years. Taking back land unilaterally for a few days, then the army comes. But it's great for morale, and it also gets the word out. Darwish and Rigby, in a book in 2015, Popular Protest in Palestine, The Uncertain Future of Unarmed Resistance, make the point that it's really important for third parties to put pressure on Israel. Whatever the Palestinians do, the Israelis aren't going to pay that much attention unless there's others calling their attention to it. And that's where BDS comes in. It's not the only thing, but it is a very, very important aspect of this whole battle in quotes, this nonviolent battle. There's a copy of Omar Barghouti's book, BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction, the Global Struggle for Palestinian Rights, on the back table, that you can take a look at. And I don't know how many of you are involved in or have been discussing BDS. Is this something that your meeting has talked about at all? There's been a lot of Quaker involvement, and I want to call your attention particularly to the website Quaker PI. Not only does it have minutes from various meetings, monthly meetings, yearly meetings, and so on in various parts of the world, but also an outline of a workshop given at French General Conference Gathering this past summer by Max Carter and his daughter Maya, who is now an associate professor, I believe, of political science, on Quakers' historical involvement with boycott, so that people can sort of think it through, because some folks are not that comfortable with it. And for those not comfortable with boycott as such, you can divest from companies that aren't even Israeli. You can divest from Caterpillar that makes the bulldozers that knock down people's homes. You can divest from Hewlett-Packard and G4S that have to do with security implementation, the wall and prisons and so on. There's a long list, and you can find many of those on one of the websites that you have, whoprofits.org. It was set up originally by the Israeli Coalition of Women for Peace, and it's now a freestanding organization and has gotten increasingly user-friendly. So you can kind of pick and choose, and you can still be supporting the movement and educating the public. There's been a lot of big recent strides, and you can see a lot about it on the timeline on the BDS movement website, and also you can look at more recent years because they didn't keep updating the timeline, unfortunately. And you can click on each one and you get all the background. So for instance, when I looked at the Britain Yearly Meeting minute on boycott of settlement products in April of 2011, you click on it and it gives their whole background of their interaction with the Jewish community, the minutes that came from various area meetings, and that inspired us to take a similar approach in Canadian yearly meeting. We got minutes first from monthly meetings, and then when we brought it to the yearly meeting, they passed the minute with no opposition. So now we're moving on, we're thinking about trying to get the Canadian government, or advise the Canadian government to cut its military and policing ties with Israel. Here in the States, of course, there's a matter of a whole lot of money that goes to Israeli military efforts that I think would be a really Quakerly thing to think about talking about to the government. Finishing up here, some more highlights here. I'll skip through this because it's getting late. Jewish Voice for Peace endorsed the BDS call of 2005 in February 2015. Independent Jewish Voices in Canada did it a bit earlier in 2009. And also in 2009, something I don't have on my slideshow, but interests you Quakers and other church people, is the so-called Kairos Palestine document. This was modeled on the Kairos South Africa document against apartheid many years ago. And basically, Christian churches, leaders of Christian churches in Palestine coming together, maybe for the first time ever, because these churches are very often at each other's throats, literally, and came together calling upon the world to support boycott, divestment, and sanctions to try to get Palestinians' rights. That was in 2009. In 2010, Ramallah Friends meeting, where Jane Zara was the acting clerk, passed a minute sent an epistle to friends everywhere calling on them to consider adopting boycott, divestment, and sanctions as we may be led to bring Palestinians their rights. And the Presbyterians have some very good resources. A couple of them I have on the back table there. Steadfast Hope, about the Palestinian quest for a just peace, and the newer Zionism Unsettled. And both of them have video material that you can actually watch in its entirety, I believe, on the website before you decide whether you want to buy the pamphlet that goes with it, which is complimentary. They don't duplicate each other. And they're wonderful if you want to have like a study group or something. You can take a look at those later. These are different churches that have passed resolutions recommending boycott, divestment, etc. This I should take out, I guess this was for when I was in the LA area, just to know I'm thinking about them too. It's something we can all participate in. We can choose our level, we can do it as Omar Barghouti says, do what you can sustain in your community. So just to finish up, last couple of slides here. Thank you for your patience. You've just seen a small sampling of ways that Palestinians and Israelis are using nonviolent means to end the occupation and associated violations of human and civil rights of Palestinians, and some examples of how we as internationals can participate in this vital work. Despite the generally bleak situation in recent months, I want to end on a note of hope, hoping that we can be energized by the inspiring words of a couple of longtime Palestinian nonviolent activists. Noah Souf worked very closely with Netta Golan in the setting up of the International Solidarity Movement, and before that was one of her first and strongest allies in the village of Hares, which I described earlier. He'd been 14 years in an Israeli prison, came home, and I found him washing the dishes, and I said, wow, this is a bit unusual, Palestinian man voluntarily washing the dishes. He said, I was away for 14 years, I owe it to my wife. That was lovely. And just the last one, Jonathan Koutab is a Palestinian pacifist lawyer that is always he's about the most quotable person I know. He differentiates between optimism and hope. Optimists, he says, expect change for the better in the near future. Hope, though, is a spiritual quality, and, quote, those filled with and driven by hope operate in difficult circumstances with the faith and certainty that evil and oppression and injustice cannot prevail ultimately, and that oppressive structures carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. One thing is sure, he concludes, the arch of history, however long, bends towards justice, and we must continue to work for justice with hope and faith and concern for both Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs.